to do today is to give you a little bit of history, not just about Shriners Hospital, but a little bit about Shreveport. There are a lot of reasons why the world's first Shriners Hospital is here in Shreveport. When I first came to work at Shriners Hospital in 2002, Louis McGee was one of the people I asked, why was the world's first Shriners Hospital here? And everybody had a little bit of a piece of the story, but it took us several years of going through archives and doing some research to come up with what the story really was. And so I'm going to try and tell you a little bit about that. And finally, what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about what we do at Shriners Hospital here in Shreveport and what changes we're seeing, and then open up for maybe some discussion or questions if you have. The Shriners Hospital for Children is an organization with 22 hospitals throughout North America. And they're dedicated to providing specialty pediatric services to children in the United States as well as Canada and Mexico. And we take care of children with orthopedic conditions. Our hospital in Shreveport is limited to orthopedic conditions treatment. And we also now take care of kids with cleft lip and palate. We also have other hospitals that take care of kids with spinal cord injuries and burn injuries as well. Now, you may not know much about Shriners fraternity, but following the Civil War in 1872 in New York City, yes, New York City, there are a group of Master Masons who met at the Knickerbocker Cottage for lunch, and they got together and decided they would like to form an organization that would be fun. And you saw a picture there with Dr. Fleming and Bill Florence. They were the first two members of the fraternity. And what they did is they decided to put together a group that would undertake types of pageantry and fun and frolic, and that's where a lot of the symbolism that you see associated with the Shriners, the wearing of the fez, the scimitar, and all that, is all part of the pageantry. You see the scimitar right there. And the Shriners, initially, what they started out doing was they had a number of different philanthropic type of activities they were doing in their different communities throughout North America. Early on, one of the things that they helped out was with the flood in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. That was really the first time the Shriners as an organization stepped forward to help people in their local communities. Later on, here in our own backyard, Shriners from this area helped out after the devastating hurricane in 1900 down in Galveston, where anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 people were killed. A few years later, out west, when the San Francisco earthquake occurred, Shriners from the western part of the United States came together to help out the people who suffered from that calamity. Now later on, as we had men returning from the Great War, they had big ideas. They had seen the devastation in Europe, and they wanted to commit themselves to where the same things that they encountered over in Europe would never see a spot here in the United States. And so we had a group of people came back dedicated to doing something big. But the Shriners, as it was growing in numbers, after World War I was approximately about 200,000 members, they couldn't decide what it was they wanted to do. Finally, a gentleman by the name of Freeland Kindred, who later on became mayor of Philadelphia, he first proposed in 1920 the idea of putting together a Shriners Peace Memorial. It didn't get a lot of traction. It was a fairly new idea, but they decided they would put together a committee to study the idea of Shriners taking care of children with crippling diseases. You see, in 1921, they had a meeting in their annual meeting for Shriners, their imperial session as they call it, in Des Moines, Iowa. And there was a report there, and what they were talking about doing was building the very first Shriners Hospital in St. Louis. St. Louis was centrally located, had a lot of transportation opportunities there. That's what the plan was. But they were bogging down. If you know anything about St. Louis, it's an older city, and actually where they built the hospital up in St. Louis eventually happened to be the building where I went to graduate school, next to Washington University School of Medicine. And so what they decided to do is they were to commit themselves to having orthopedic hospitals. And they couldn't decide where they were going to do that. This is where the Shreveport history enters into it. There was a local businessman here by the name of Jim Rowland. Mr. Rowland was a banker here in town. He also served as the head of the Calipari School Board at one time. He was also past Grand Master of the state of Louisiana. And he was the very first potentate or head of El Caruba Shriners here in Shreveport. Now what Mr. Rowland did is, being a good banker, he knew how to put ideas together. And he came up with a plan where he taught 10 people, this is in 1921, 10 people to put up $1,000 each to purchase an option to buy a piece of property on the edge of town. Now, there is no proof that Jim Rowland put a penny of his own money up, and that's why I said he was a good banker. So what they did is, after they got back from Iowa, they met, and there were some deep pockets people here in Shreveport because oil and gas was booming at that time. So what they did is they got an option to buy 5.9 acres on the edge of town, which is at the corner of Kings Highway and Sanford, where our hospital is right now. That piece of property was important for several reasons. One, it was 5.9 acres, so it was the same size as the property that the Shriners were trying to get put together in St. Louis. Second thing was, it was on the edge of the trolley run. I don't know if there's that many people around here remember that public transportation in Shreveport meant riding the trolley. That was as far out as the trolley went in town. And the third thing was, is being the good banker that he was, he knew that property on the edge of town was cheaper than in town. So what they decided to do is they proposed to the Shriners organization's committee that was looking at building hospitals, and they proposed building it here in Shreveport. One of the reasons was that Shreveport, you may not have known this, but Shreveport was one of the few cities in this part of the United States that exited the Civil War unscathed, because the Union troops and the Confederate forces never fought here. So unlike many other cities in our part of the world, Shreveport still had infrastructure in place from the Civil War on up to World War I. And to this day still remains a transportation center. So what they did is they had transportation capabilities here that a lot of other towns didn't have. Secondly, this is a part of an article from the New York Times from 1919 talking about the oil boom here in this part of Louisiana. And as many of you know that are in the oil and gas business, the world's first offshore oil well was drilled at Caddo Lake. There are a lot of places throughout the United States that are interested in having the very first Shriners Hospital. This map depicts some of the cities that had made a proposal to build the first Shriners Hospital. And as you see there, we left Shreveport off there because you know where it is. But you can see there, far and wide, there are a lot of places that were vying for it. And it was because we had some very enterprising and well-connected people here in the city of Shreveport that they were able to do it. What ended up happening is you had Mr. Rowland, the local banker, and the mayor of Shreveport at that time, a fellow by the name of L.E. Thomas. They took the train to Atlanta, Georgia. They met with the Imperial Council's committee, and they proposed building the hospital here. They also had several things going for them. Whenever Jim Rowland made his presentation, he said, we have the option on 5.9 acres. Is that large enough? He knew the answer, because that was the same size of the property they're trying to get to St. Louis. Being a good banker, he also had a bank book with him showing that they had already started collecting money. And the third thing he had, and this is probably what sealed the deal, because 3/4 of the Shreveport Medical Society were members of El Caruba Shriners at that time. The Shreveport Medical Society had promised the services of a qualified orthopedic surgeon for 1 year at the Medical Society's expense if they built the first Shriners Hospital here. And that sealed the deal. That's why the hospital came here to Shreveport. So in September of 1921, Jim Rowland and L.E. Thomas were given the green light to go back to Shreveport and get things going. This is a piece out of the Atlanta Journal from that time showing Jim Rowland here in the back, if you can see. It's not working so well. Jim Rowland with that committee, and they started getting things moving at that point. A lot of articles from the newspaper in 1921 talking about the first Shriners Hospital that would be built here. The building, for those of you who are my age and older, you'll recall the building that was down there in the corner of Kings Highway in Sanford. I'll show you a picture in a minute. It was a beautiful building. Constructed in the early 1920s. It was an old Romanesque type of structure. It was designed by a local architect here by the name of Ed Neal. You may recall Mr. Neal's firm was later named Neal and Sundahl, and now goes by the name of Sundahl and Associates. They're still working today. Mr. Neal was a fairly well-known architect in this part of the United States. He designed the Scottish Rite Cathedral here in downtown. He designed the Caddo Parish Courthouse. And interestingly, the Caddo Parish Courthouse here was the first courthouse ever designed that had the lockup for prisoners on the roof. Think about it. It's harder to escape from the rooftop than it is from the ground floor. And so, some of the other places that he designed, he also designed the museum out at the State Fairgrounds. Mr. Neal, when he designed the courthouse there, it got the attention of another Shriner from Kansas City area, who came down here and saw some of the designs that Mr. Neal had done. And this Shriner from Kansas City was so impressed with Mr. Neal that he hired Mr. Neal's firm to design the courthouse up in Kansas City, which looks a lot like the courthouse here in Shreveport. The Shriner was a fellow by the name of Harry S. Truman. And in 1949, he hired Mr. Neal to be one of the chief architects on the renovations of the White House. So that's our local connection there for the White House. In 1922, they laid the cornerstone at the hospital. This is a copy of the handout they had that day. We had it in a time capsule there at the old Shriners Hospital. And they laid the cornerstone there, and they opened up the new hospital, at that time, new hospital, first Shriners Hospital, later in 1922. You see the picture there at the top. The red roof clay tile you see there, that's emblematic of the fez that the Shriners wear. And if you were to visit our hospital in Montreal, Canada, it's the oldest hospital we still have of the original design. It still has the red clay tile. The picture you see on the right, the black and white photograph, is a photograph that one of our employees received from one of her church-going members. Said they had an old photograph of Shriners Hospital, and when we saw the picture there, we knew that's probably taken from the winter of 1922-23. You can see there, they didn't do any landscaping yet, and I love the outfit that the lady's wearing there.